everyone. Welcome back to the Autistic Tidbits and Tangents podcast. I'm your host, Cara Diamond. I'm an autistic teacher and university lecturer from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And with me, I have my co-host, Bruce Petherick, who is filling in for Maya Tudale at the moment, who is on maternity leave. Now, Bruce, do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Hello, my name is Bruce Petherick. My day job is autistic advocate for Autism Canada, and in my previous life, I was a musician and with a strange accent.
Oh, a lovely accent. I could listen to it forever. With us today, we also have a guest. We have Peter O'Neill, who is an author of a recent book called My So-Called Disorder, but he is so much more than that. He has worked as a litigator who has successfully taken on automotive industry giants like General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Hyundai, Toyota, Nissan, and others. I'm surprised I pronounced them all, hopefully all right. And he first gained recognition as a paralegal when he represented burn victims in a case against GM for the side saddle fuel tank disaster. So he also, that's a little bit about him professionally, but he's also a husband. He's a father of 3, a grandfather of 1. He's the youngest of 7. That must have been a busy household. And he was identified as autistic at the age of 65. And one of his passions is the music of Chuck Berry. So we're going to talk to him a lot about his life, his memoir. Actually, he has multiple books, so they will probably both come up. And we're going to pick his brain about how being autistic has helped him in his career.
Welcome to Autistic Tidbits and Tangents.
Candid conversations between autistic off-hour professionals.
Cool.
Trigger warnings for this episode are remarkably few. We might reference ableism. We talk about a world in which neurodivergent people are the majority. And that's really about it. All right, Bruce, do you want to start us off with a question?
Oh, you put me on the spot. Actually, Pete, I have a deeper question which I want to get to later. I think the obvious question is, how much of you being autistic has helped you in your career? From the legal perspective, I'll go into other things later.
Well, it's a good one because, of course, I never knew how much it helped me, but it was huge. There are so many things. When I first learned that I might be autistic, my therapist sent me home with a book. I read the book, but then I wasn't convinced, so I started looking for other information about what it means. And the first thing I found this time was something about the strengths of autistic people. And each of those bullet points, there were about 25, each one of them applied to my career. It felt almost phony to read all this, but things like as simple as persistence. Like when I get started on something, I don't let go until I've gotten there. Eye for detail. I've joked a little about that movie, The Sixth Sense, but I see things that other people just don't see, and then make connections between things that I found. I think a big one is creativity. They often say, and when I'm reading about what it means to be autistic, that people think outside the box. We think differently, and I know that's true. I've put together. In fact, I have one sitting here, but I've put together dozens and dozens of really kind of fun and funny exhibits that I use against experts or against people. And they're never expecting it. They think that I'm going to come in as a dry, normal attorney, and then I pull out something very strange. So just in every way, I think where it doesn't help me is in speaking. it's not my forte. So I have to really practice what I'm going to say to a judge or anyone else. But I get by because I think normally people believe me because they can see I know the subject better than anyone else. And that's the biggest, there's two biggest things. Cara mentioned the cases involving the trucks, and they just horribly burned people. They put the gas tanks on the outside of the truck. So if you hit the truck on the side, it created often a huge fire that burned either the person in the truck or the person who was in the car that hit the truck. And so it's a real motivator. But I knew more about that truck. I never stopped thinking about that truck for about 7 or 8 years. They're parked all around. I would duck under them. I'd climb under them. So that sort of obsessive desire to learn everything you can about a subject was huge.
That would have served you very well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, whereas Chuck Berry was my first true great special interest, I wore a shirt with him on it.
Awesome.
And it's an honor today. But those trucks became really my second huge one that was lifelong and that I learned more about than anyone on earth.
I just think that's incredible. And I loved it in the book because you do talk about it in one or two of the chapters, how tenacious you were in, you'd be in a room full of discovery, all of the boxes, and you'd find something no one else found, even though there's 3 or 4 people in the room with you going through the boxes. And how you constructed models to recreate like the physics of accidents in a way that could bring it alive for a jury so they could see like what you're saying has merit and what the other person is saying could not have possibly happened.
Yeah.
I love that.
So to me, once I've learned what it means to be autistic, I'm going to lose my voice this morning. I was just stunned. I could see that, I did a ton of hard work, so you can't ignore that part, but I could see how it was a huge assist for me. And the reason I started writing a book in the first place was that I also read that 80% of autistic people, I don't believe this figure, but are unemployed or underemployed. I think underemployed is probably the key word there. But I could see where if I hadn't been very lucky, I would have been in the same place. But I could also see that being autistic made me way better than most people who did my kind of work. They might be better at the speaking part. They might be better at the human interaction part. And those are huge. People have to be able to talk to a jury in a way that draws them in. But boy, I knew more about the subjects of my cases than anybody, including the experts on the other side. So I knew I wanted to write something for my legal community, just to say, if you miss out on people like me, you're missing out. And then also, it became a bigger story because I realized one day, laughing with my therapist, that it's also got to be about Chuck Berry. It's got to be about all this stuff. It's all got to come in. So, well,
that's what makes it such a beautiful book, because it's so human. It captures so much of who you are. I felt like I knew you. It was really relatable. A lot of the things that you described, I personally related to some of your experiences. Now, also just tangent going back, it was so funny when you said that you would prepare what you would say before a judge. Like, I can't fathom doing it any other way. I prepare before every parent-teacher interview. I prepare before, every staff meeting, things that I want to say. It's so hard to imagine that other people don't do that.
And yet I've seen it happen.
I'm sure.
I think most lawyers will prepare for, their arguments in front of a judge, but they don't necessarily prepare before a deposition. I'll write out every question. I might then throw it away, but I've written it out beforehand.
Yeah. How very autistic of you and me, and probably Bruce. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about Chuck Berry. I'm really curious.
Okay. Can I jump in? Sorry. So just before, because this podcast is all about tangents, right? Do you have, Cara, do you have your questions written down?
No, For this kind of thing, I tend to try to wing it because I want to challenge myself to make sure I listen, so then I can follow up. Right.
So Peter, get ready for Tangent City.
Yes.
I want to bring up the creativity because obviously, and it's kind of strange that the three of us are creative in ways that I don't think people have thought that autistics could be. Peter, you may not know that Cara actually started to be a performer, a drama, and she did drama and wrote plays. And I have read one of her plays that you wrote at what stupid age, 17?
I think it first started as a monologue when I was 16, 17, and then I fleshed it out when I was 18.
Like it's ridiculous mature. Like it's a wonderful work. Anyway, the three of us are really creative in that old school way of what creativity means. In other words, performing arts, plastic arts, that sort of thing. And I think research has always been creative, which I'll put a lot of your early legal work in. What does it mean? Do you think that we are, as we're becoming more open with the world and as we start dropping our masks, do you think there's going to be a flourishing of autistic creativity as a different idea that neurotypical creativity is? And parenthetically, I may just be hosting a conference about this topic in October.
I don't know. I don't know if our creativity is different from other people's creativity, but I suspect, I've read the line that many artists, writers, musicians are autistic and are neurodivergent for sure. And I tend to believe it because, for one thing, I come from a very artistic family. And, you know, if you said that in a British accent, it would be autistic, basically. So I tend to think that autistic people, probably a huge percent, you're either going to fall in the engineering and numbers camp, or you're going to fall into the artistic camp, or maybe both. But I think a lot of autistic people are probably very creative in everything they do. So I don't know, but so I don't know if we'll flourish more in the past, except we maybe feel more free, you know, as time goes on, and there's less of a pejorative nature about the word, because I can still see that. I'm new to this. I guess I'm an old man to being autistic, but I'm new to saying I'm autistic, and I see two reactions. Some are sort of excited about it, and some people are, they're a little bit sad for you or something. So.
Yeah, because there's this narrative that it's a grand tragedy, right? We don't have the narrative out there yet that you can thrive, you can be creative and do incredible things. And, I'm moving towards that sort of value neutral approach. We have to be honest about the things that are strengths, and we have to be honest about the things that are hard for us, and both exist together. Creativity, though, that's a good question, Bruce. I mean, I work with many autistic students and my brother too. My brother has whole worlds in his head, like video game worlds that he's created that just exist in his mind, like different planets, the history of different, what do you call, like different, I guess, races of aliens, like different, the whole world, galaxy, universe he has mapped out. And it's all in his head. And I don't think that neurotypical people do that to the same degree.
Just to roll back tangent upon tangent upon tangent. And parenthetically, Peter, I did a post early last week on Instagram where I had heard the word autistic and thought the person that was talking said artistic, and I thought that she was going to be working with autistic children, and this is like early 80s. So you pointed about lots of musicians and lots of artists are autistic, and I always have a slight problem with the historical re-diagnosis, just because we really don't know what's inside somebody's head historically, much as and we would love to. But anyway, and that's here, there, neither here nor there. In the music world, it is extraordinarily rare for me to have ever come across an autistic musician, and even now, and that's kind of interesting. People do say this all the time, and it's like, but either it's not true, which don't think it is, or there's still this stigma that many autistics won't be open about it, or you've got the people. Tim Burton, I think, is coming to mind, where people say he's autistic, but what he says is, I'm kind of autistic, or I have sort of, I'm like everybody's autistic sort of problematic thing.
Jerry Seinfeld said something similar too.
Yeah, and
David Byrne from Talking Heads. So
David Byrne's diagnosed, as far as I know, and in my research for my conference, I actually was going to try and search for famous autistic musicians and came up with like 4. And so, like, why is that?
Well, isn't part of it? I mean, my guess is that part of it, if you're my age, I'm 67 now, you're not going to know you're autistic unless you present it in some way that made it really obvious to people a while ago. Mm-hmm. I lucked into this diagnosis. I walked to the exact right person. But I think a lot of people probably simply don't know. And I have a feeling a lot of younger people, I've seen younger people on YouTube or whatever who announce themselves as autistic. It's become a thing. I noticed on American Idol, we watched a little bit of that recently, and a lot of the performers are autistic, and it's inspirational and whatever. But, maybe it's just that people don't know.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point, because we don't always fit the diagnostic criteria, especially historically. I think people are becoming more aware of how autism can look in different people and at different ages and stages. Now, that makes me wonder, okay, what would you go back and tell your young self?
You talking to me now?
Yes. Well, actually, why not both of you? You could both answer that question.
I've been talking a lot, so I'll let Bruce first answer. I know exactly what my...
Okay, so I'm going to guess what Peter's answer is, and I won't say it out loud. I will say, fundamentally, I would go back and explain what autism means, and then basically say, don't change anything. Mm-hmm. Be maybe a little aware of people taking advantage of you, but this is something I've thought about a lot, because people at work clients have often questioned that, like, would you change anything? And the answer is fundamentally no, but maybe talking about social communication and understanding that that's a struggle would have been okay. So, Peter, your response.
Well, I say it in the book, so it's no mystery. My biggest struggle, I led an interesting life. I liked the life I led, everything I did. The social part was obviously, especially at a certain level when I went off to college young, and I just even remember thinking to myself, I don't know what to do here. They've all got friends. I don't know how to make those friends. And the thing I also say in the book, the thing I really wanted, I had a couple of guy friends. I wanted that girlfriend, a real one. So I'd go back and teach myself how to respond, how to make that happen, because I really had no clue. If I was with someone, it actually went quite fine, but I didn't know how to reciprocate. I didn't know how to follow up on those things. So I'd give myself a 15-minute lesson on that. And I suspect it would have changed my life, because I felt like I kept learning from experience. So if I had some guidance, which I flat out did not have from any quarter, then I think it would have really helped. I think that it's sort of a point I make, is that really, if there's some young autistic person who's having these sort of troubles in your life, They need the guidance. I noticed that when a part of my book is about going to Africa, and everything changed for me in Africa.
Oh, yeah.
Because they didn't, A, know how weird I was, but I also had to learn all these new social skills. And B, even there were some Peace Corps trainers who told us what to do. They said, go to the village, make friends with the movers and shakers, and invite them to your house, and that was helpful. That's the kind of, I needed actual teaching that, in the case of the girlfriends, this girl likes you. You need to respond. You need to now return this,
Yes.
interest on your own tomorrow, not today, and I never could figure any of that stuff out. You might want to ask her name. Some of the examples in the book, they're fairly extreme, but they're very true.
And I love in the book too, one of the women in your book that was probably interested in you when you were, young, like late teens, early 20s, you met later as an adult and were able to talk about those experiences.
Yeah, and we became really good friends. And in fact, with her, I remember telling her we do it mostly online, but that I'd considered whether I was autistic. I had been watching a TV show called Parenthood, and they had this young guy. He didn't faze me at all. But then this older guy came in, and they didn't tell you he was autistic, but you were supposed to figure it out. And as soon as he came on, I shut down the TV, got out my computer. And unfortunately, everything I saw was negative and horrible. So I just said, forget it. That's not me. Mm-hmm. Said no empathy, no understanding of sarcasm, things like that. But she was, I think, the first person I told. I even tried to figure out whether I was autistic at one point, but decided I wasn't.
Yeah. And here you are.
You've raised two really interesting things, and one's going to change my early answer, funnily enough. And let me do that one first. The friends is interesting because the weirdness, I suppose weirdness, the thing about Australia is that you normally go to university in the same city as you went to high school. Mm-hmm. And I know, like, around the rest of the world, that's not that common. Like, people tend to want to go somewhere else. So when I did my first degree, there was probably 40 kids from my high school through this relatively large university. And I had started, funnily enough, doing medicine anyway, and I had 10 friends doing medicine. And I only learned to make friends when I started my third degree at a different institution where I knew nobody. And that was kind of interesting. It was like, as you've just described, except a couple of years later, that I was forced to learn how to make friends, because before I had these friends from school, and whether they were friends or not doesn't really matter. It was like there was a comfort area. The other thing you said was something I've thought about so often, is one of the reasons I think autistic people are good travelers is because we realize we're going to a different culture and we have to learn the rules. And then I don't think we look at that inwardly going, we really don't have cultural connections in our own physical culture, and we need to learn cultural rules. And it's a wonderful emphasizer of one of the major problems that we have when it comes to social communication. Actually can be thought of as cultural.
Mm-hmm. Well, my interview with Dr. Alyssa Hillary Zisk, she talked about being in China, they talked about being in China, and that the culture, because they anticipate you will make social mistakes as an American, people don't hold it against you. Whereas within your own culture, people expect you should know better. And so I think that's such a good point about going to other places. You're sort of on a level playing field with any other traveler to that area. And because people expect that you won't know everything, they're very forgiving or helpful and make what is usually sort of implicit explicit. They'll sort of explain to you what you should be doing.
Now, if only we could get our own society to treat us that way.
Yeah. Well,
I was thinking of this from our perspective as like we're foreigners, and learning about another culture is really great because it gives us a set of rules and a matrix. But your point about when you're traveling, people tend to be more forgiving of your social mistakes did emphasize suddenly. It was like, wow, when I make a cultural mistake here, I'm criticized rather than being forgiven or explained. Or that's a good, it's the double empathy problem translated into traveling.
yes. Now back to you, Peter.
Sorry.
I want to hear about Chuck Berry and your passion and how that developed.
So I had a brother, Steve-O. He died very young, but he, in 99% chance that he was autistic. And he was very different from all the rest of us. We're all kind of, these very intelligent, and Steve-O's intelligence was completely different, and hard to describe. But one thing he knew everything about was kind of pop culture. And he knew things that we didn't know, like this was during the Vietnam War, and Sammy Davis Jr. was a friend of Richard Nixon's, and we all thought that was just terrible. That made him an outcast from youth culture. And Steve was talking about, man, this guy, he can do anything. He can dance, he can act, he can drum, he can sing, he's everything. But one day, a couple of days, I remember these two conversations really clearly. He was talking about this guy who was better than Elvis. His name was Chuck Berry, and he wasn't a real blues man, but he could play the blues. He must have come up through this. And like Steve-O, even though he couldn't possibly in these pre-internet days have known Chuck Berry's story, he knew the story. He knew that, yeah, he came up through the blues, and that's how he became a star. Anyway, for whatever reason, I clung on to that. And finally, there are a couple of times. First, I saw him on TV and I wasn't impressed, but I've seen that TV show again. I was right not to be impressed. But one day he came to town, and I went into this theater with my two sisters. We arrived there right on time, for the beginning of the show, not realizing that for some reason Chuck Berry was playing first before the local acts and before this strange little act. And so we go into this big auditorium, seats maybe 5,000 people, and there's probably 300 or 400 people in the entire auditorium. And we could just walk up to the very front, and I was just mesmerized. And I always knew that I was as mesmerized by his sort of aloneness up there as anything else. He was with the local band. They were terrible. I shouldn't say they were terrible, but they weren't very good. They weren't up to his. And he, played this half-hour show that just drew me in. And I guess the fact that you could be right there, 20 feet away, really drew me in. And what I only realized when I began writing my first autistic memoir, not knowing that it was autistic, is that this was like as my father lay dying. He was dying in a hospital right then. And I'd forgotten that fact, but I just grabbed onto that guy. The next day I bought a record, when I saw him live, I was thinking, well, but that's a Beatles song, right? Or that's, and then I started realizing, oh, this guy wrote those songs. And so it just became something in me. Everybody knew within a few months, even people I didn't know would say, oh yeah, you're that Chuck Berry freak. It was something I talked about constantly. Yeah. And I remember, it's what makes me laugh now about the show Parenthood, because there's a boy on it who talks about bugs all the time, and I didn't see any connection. Now I do, because I talked about Chuck Berry 100% of the time. My kids grew up with Chuck Berry, because even though I've learned not to talk about him quite so much, he's still there. He's like some old uncle, that they've never met, but that I talk about. So.
But you've met. That must have been just an incredible experience to talk to him and be in the same room.
I never met him for long, but I met him the first time a few months after I first saw him. He played at some little former grocery store at Lake Tahoe in California. And I shook his hand. I remember screaming, "You're my idol." But yeah, no, I got to meet him several times and slowly, start doing things. I gave him, actually, it's right here, but it's gone. Excuse me. I gave him one time a little framed version of this picture, which he had forgotten about. And it's so wonderful because it's a picture we figured out, me and another guy, and I won't comment on his neurology, but we figured out that he's using a telescope here. And eventually I figured out he's on the roof and all the shadows are behind him. Yeah. So he's looking at the sun. He's actually doing real astronomical work here. And then my friend who is in Sweden figured out that there were 2 total solar eclipses in St. Louis that year.
Oh my goodness. So you're able to date it. Yeah.
Pardon?
So you were able to roughly date it, or not even roughly,
yeah.
Pretty precisely.
And then he and my wife, I tell the story in the book, but he and my wife, it's sad because I let it stay in the sun here, so it's gone now. But he and my wife and his son figured out the year too, because he was going, wow, what's 1926 plus 12? And they came up with the same year. Which I kind of love because I don't know, Cara, you may be too young to know Chuck Berry's music, but there's a line, American History and Practical Math, in one of his songs. And that's what they were doing there, is they were talking about American history and doing some practical math to figure out the year.
Amazing.
So that was the most rewarding time. It made him so happy to see that picture. He just ran dancing down the aisle, down the hallway.
Yeah. I just love that. That's incredible. And what a gift. I mean, for both of you, what a gift, right? To have that interaction and to, know that you've done something for him, but probably he also is aware that he's done something for you as well.
Well, that part was clear. He knows he's done something for a lot of people. I remember once he described his shows as, people had wanted to play new stuff, and he'd say, "You don't understand. This is a ceremony that we're performing up here. This is a sort of semi-religious thing." So he knows he made people happy, but yeah, it was fun knowing I made him just as happy, if only for a few seconds.
Yeah. And your first book is about that, right? Is about Chuck Berry.
Yeah, and I don't know if I can ever publish it because I took some of those chapters that you see in the book were from that, Yeah. It was funny because I wrote that book knowing that I have this strange relationship with this man that's impossible to explain. And I think that was the fatal flaw of the book is it's like, so you're writing a book about what a weirdo you are. You've obsessed over this man for your entire life. And so it was a really good book, and it is probably the most autistic book ever written, But I took some of those chapters, and you see them in the current book that I actually got out there. Yeah. That the first book never got out there. So. Yeah.
I love in the book, and actually, funnily enough, it's probably in both books, but I haven't read the Chuck Berry book. It's reflection of some privilege that I have, is that story about you showing the picture of him looking through a telescope is a really, really human story that I think a lot of people, when they talk about, especially musical heroes, they don't think they're human. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. It's just that everybody, all that an audience knows is what they do as performer and maybe social media posts. Where I've had the privilege of touring with many, many famous musicians and lived the human story. Like a famous band I was touring in, I think it's in Paris, a very famous Australian band. Lead singer was partying. The rest of the band and I were back in the hotel rooms because they all wanted to talk to their family. They didn't want to go and have a party. They didn't want to go drink. They just we were in the middle of a big long tour. These people just want to go and talk to their family and see how the kids were. And it's that. I mean, I've had that privilege to see the reality, but what I love is that you're showing that reality as well. Like Chuck Berry is this person that a lot of people know about, listen to his music, knew the Beatles songs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as a 12-year-old he loved astronomy. Like that's suddenly, that's got nothing to do with him as a musician, but everything to do about him as a human. And that you connected, that you two, like, that was such a close connection. It wasn't about, here, sign this album, but I know what telescope and I know what you were doing that day. And isn't that cool?
His main interest was his shoes.
Oh,
He
yeah,
said,
big
look
shoe
at those shoes, because he was wearing these long two-tone leather shoes. But no, I think, and that's how I see him, as this extremely flawed, human being, but totally as a human being and very much alone in the world. I mean, he has, it's interesting that a lot of his fans that I know who are his super fans, because they've all gotten, I had a blog, they got in touch with me, I got to know them. They all use telescopes. They all have a lot of these. Chuck Berry had a dark room. I had a dark room when I was a kid. That was one of my interests for a while, was making pictures. So there are these odd connections. But for me, the most interesting one with him is, I think he was congenitally lonely. He had his family, and he had, probably his groupies or whatever. But other than that, I think he was very much alone. And that interests me, because I'm a very, very solitary person, but a person who needs to have the really close people too, the really good friends or the family.
Yeah. I mean, everything you're saying makes me wonder if he could have been autistic. Just that relationship with alone, that curiosity, passions for topics that, not everyone falls into, but that are excessively interesting.
Yeah,
a dark room, astronomy, music, He
had some famous little blowouts. There's a movie about him where he gets really angry at Keith Richards about things where I think he had every right to be angry. Yeah. But no, it's interesting to wonder.
Yeah, you never know. Oh.
Loneliness is interesting. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I know, let's go on another tangent. I wonder, I'm just trying to think about, there's no such thing as a typical autistic. We get that. Okay. But vast majority of autistics I know are comfortable by being alone, with being alone. Does that mean we're lonely, or is it just we're comfortable being by ourselves?
I think for the most part, I'm comfortable being by myself. There are very few times where I have thought I feel lonely. Like usually I regenerate in solitude. I regenerate getting to because that's when I engage most with my interests. You can't really engage with your interests around other people. And we get so much out of, whether it's noodling on the guitar like you do, Peter, or whatever I'm inspired to do on the day, reading, writing, singing some jazz. I don't do those things typically in front of other people. And they're what gives me the bulk of my dopamine comes from those things.
And you're not lonely?
There have been times, like I think in childhood I felt lonely. Not having friends at school, I felt lonely. But I didn't feel lonely when I was doing those things. I didn't feel lonely when I was, writing, like sitting down and writing Agatha Christie style books as a, 12-year-old, because I was creating worlds. And in those worlds, I wasn't lonely.
Sorry, Peter, I interrupted you.
Oh, no. Yes, being solitary is for me not being lonely. I need a lot of time being by myself. I'm impressed that I invented a career or a job style where I work from home, for the most part. But I really like being by myself. I need having those close people, but I don't think I'm lonely very often. Maybe, as Cara says, sometimes. And one thing I'll ask you folks, so I diagnosed and I foolishly launched into writing a whole book about my entire life and putting it all out there. And then I start getting calls from people. I only have a few friends who followed me through life, from one from grade school, a couple from high school, one from college, but people that I only see once in a while. I've been surprised at the number of people who've told me, I've read your book and I've never told you this about myself. And I'm suddenly realizing, okay, so I ask them, do you feel some sort of connection to my stories? And yeah, my best friend told me stuff about himself that I'd never known. And he believes he's also autistic.
Wow.
And he's the only person. I've also got to say, as a late diagnosed person, nobody has fought me on this except him originally said, you're not autistic, but then he told me that he thinks he is. And I wonder with you two, if you found old friends, who turned out to be neurodivergent as well.
Yes, I've had a few people come out of the woodworks from high school who are exploring or have received diagnoses, and definitely also, a couple people that I was close with during university believe they are, or I have believed for a long time that they are as well. Yeah, I think you can. I certainly become comfortable with people who communicate in a similar way to me, who are very direct and upfront, but also who like to have these kind of deep tangential conversations about a lot of topics. And that isn't everybody. That tends to be people who are autistic, who have ADHD, other types of neurodivergence. It's just very comfortable. So it's not surprising that many of my friends would fall under those categories.
I've had the exact opposite reaction, which is really kind of weird. When I came out, 100% of people basically told me they weren't surprised. There was another life event that happened to me, and everyone went, "I'm not surprised." So that was just, it was wrong. So that there is, I'm just thinking, my kind of best friend from school, who unfortunately is a doctor, but I think he's self-diagnosed, but he calls himself autistic-like, and that's like, I'm not sure. And okay, cool, good. But he's the only person. What I will say, though, is that when I taught in high school, every time I diagnosed in front of a class, several students came up to me and said, I think I'm autistic, or I think I'm neurodivergent. And you saying this has made me want to go on and investigate or disclose. And that's, for me, that was life-changing for me. That's actually why I started to want to be a mentor. Just this random, I shouldn't say random, but part of the teaching process, telling the students, like, I'm autistic, I've been diagnosed. And if you find something I do strange, just come and talk to me about it. I'm quite happy to talk. And then that allowing people from the class to also start disclosing, or at least consider disclosing, because they're at a high school, and that's a good thing. So it's interesting. Maybe I'm not keeping in contact with old friends enough or something, and that's okay.
Well, I mean, you did move continents, so
I did.
Friendships do tend to wax and wane in life anyways, but especially if you make such a big move, I'm sure you're not as in touch with people from Australia now that you've been in Canada for how many years now? Quite
21.
a while. 21.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But let me propose this. Like, one thing I knew before I knew I was autistic is my friends were not sort of the guys who would play sports or do any of the things. As I understand it, you were an incredible soccer player, and that probably put you in a very different cohort than I was in. I was with the artistic types.
So it's interesting. I none of the people I played soccer with were friends. There was one guy who I actually met when I was like 10, who we met on the street a couple of times after we both finished, and he's a good acquaintance, but I was never friends with the people who played soccer. In fact, I used to say things like, there was one time we were coming home from a game in a bus, and the coach had noticed that I wasn't disappointed, and he said, like, you should be sad, we lost. And I went, oh, I thought the whole experience was so aesthetic. I enjoyed the aesthetic aspects of that so much. And of course, I had like 30 people just look at me going, what sort of freak am I? So although it did play at a very high level, I never felt that sort of manly man bloke thing. And even, when I was playing overage soccer here, I had some good friends come from that, but they were people I knew from university and college, and they just happened to play in the same soccer team. In fact, it's kind of weird when you talked about in the book about not being that sort of usual boy man growing up. That is very much me. Although I had to pretend, I had to be part of it, but just I never felt comfortable, ever. Still don't.
There are things I thought about this before coming on, so I'll try to make this into a question. But I was thinking, in my life, there are professions or activities that I look at, and I just think, how can people do this? How can one of them, because we're going to do a sort of talk show, is people go on late night talk shows, and the ones who succeed there, I'm always mesmerized. I love seeing them succeed and be funny and witty, and I would just wonder how. One night in 20, I might be able to do that. Yeah. Rest of the time, there's no possible way. And another thing is just being on a sports team. Like, how could you get, in baseball, how could you get traded to another team and join that group? I've had the same job for 40 years because I can't imagine joining other groups. I'm really bad at doing that. So yeah. Are there situations like that you guys look at and wonder, how is that done?
I've had a few. So I've changed schools once in my career, and it was very traumatic to uproot and have to establish oneself in another setting. And it probably took me a few years to really adjust. And then I'm always like racked with dread because you're never guaranteed that you'll be at the same school. Every year teachers get surplused and have to be moved around, and I'm always afraid I'll be one of them. But a couple of years, actually, one of the reasons I started exploring diagnosis was because I had a very extreme response to that as a possibility. Me having to leave somewhere where I was finally established, leave a job that I love, leave work that I know how to do. I don't want to have to learn how to teach grade 7 and all of the curriculum and the math and all those things that I don't do. Like, the thought of it it's a nightmare for me. So I fully relate. Bruce?
Well, actually, it's funny. I never was traded because I always had control, and the only 2 times I ever missed was when I went back home to Melbourne. So, but the idea of being traded, as you said that, I just felt horrified. Like, just it was like, oh, that is something I've never even considered, and no, I could not do that. And of course, teaching, Peter, I taught pedagogy at university, at tertiary level, but I never got a teaching degree here in Canada because I was always adjunct. I was always teaching music theater or helping out with choir and things. So I never had to do that practical stuff because if I was told I had to move school, I went, no, bye. I would just walk away. I couldn't do it, unless it was, very well planned and managed. So that's sort of being forced to move, being forced to change. Yeah, horrific. And Kari, you've also, of course, brought out a fundamental problem with teaching profession is that you are in a perfect spot in your system. Mm-hmm. And the thought of you not specializing with autistic kids and going to work in general is such a waste of your talent.
I think I'd leave the profession if they closed my program. Like, I don't know what I would do, but I don't think I would want to. go into the classroom. Like, no. And I suspect it'll happen eventually. Like, I suspect the way things go and the underfunding of systems, I'll be forced to make some sort of choice at some point. And we'll see. We'll see when we get there.
It's
You'll be a famous podcaster by then. Sorry, Peter.
No. It's interesting because teaching is always one of the things I've at various times thought the part of lawyering I don't like is that it's become more and more of a battle. And in fact, it's like battling with the Republican Congress in the United States right now. I don't want to get too political, but just absurd battles over silly things. And so at times I wanted to leave. And teaching was one of the things that drew me. Like, I would love to teach kids, and I could teach new subjects, different years. That wouldn't bother me. Dealing with administrators, dealing with parents.
Oh, the adults are the hardest part for sure.
All of that part I would find impossible. And I think for reasons that are fairly autistic, And then the other thing is, I've never, for the last 40 years, no one's told me what to do ever. And so it would be impossible for me to be told what to do.
Well, yeah, that would be going from working for yourself to that. I'm lucky I'm in a program where I have quite a bit of freedom. There's like a suggested curriculum that I develop most of anyways. But I'm able to teach what I feel the students need. And it's very intuitive for me. And then the parts that are not intuitive, I've worked with a wonderful child and youth worker named Sonia for, I think we're going on 12, 13 years together now. And she's my teaching partner. She's the person, before I have to make a phone call, I go, okay, what do I say? Like, she'll take notes for me. She'll help me like practice things. Like, if I hadn't had her, there's no way I would have been as successful as I have been as a teacher. Yeah.
She's your EA.
Oh, well, her EA is a slightly different role. They're phasing out her role now, though, as a child and youth worker. So she's got a degree in things like counseling children and just a really like a developmental approach to child, I don't know, wellness. She's really fantastic, and she's been doing it for more than 25 years, I think. I think she's due to retire soon, and I don't know what I'll do when she retires either. So it terrifies me to think of, actually.
This came up talking to someone recently, but I was a teacher for 3 years in Africa, and I taught like middle school and had, up to 90 kids in each class. Mm-hmm. Now, I can work in an office for 5 years next to someone, not with someone. If I work with them, I know who they are. Yep. But I can work next to someone for 5 or 6 years, and I won't be sure. If they walk past me on the street, I'll go into a panic. I don't know who they are. Is that the person or not? And I had this is my grade sheet,
wow.
Hundreds of kids with names, that were like, I probably shouldn't, Adawonu, Ajaja, Adonku, Agbenyo. I knew every one of them. And, I don't know how I managed to do that. I find it interesting because it's totally against my skill set in terms of recognizing faces, learning names of people. But I knew everyone.
I'm better with children too. I'm better at remembering children for some reason. Adults, I think I get that. I think I panic when adults introduce themselves to me, first of all, and I don't remember their faces. I don't remember their names.
This is super interesting because I've got the same thing. And I remember a lot of the students that I've taught names and even like little things about them. But there are a number of teachers who've been in the same school who I might go, I think I taught at two schools so at the same time. So it's like, were you at St. Francis? Were you at Notre? Or is this somebody I've known from somewhere else that I couldn't place? But I wouldn't do that to a kid, a student. Like that's just, Now where does that come from?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because it's not facial blindness, which a lot of people have. And I think a lot of autistics have, because I can sometimes remember people's faces, And certainly I can remember children's faces. I think it is just like an anxiety thing where I don't remember adults as well.
Maybe that's it. I just figured it was some version of facial blindness, because what I noticed, like I've been in a couple big groups, the Peace Corps group, and when I joined the Peace Corps, the group in Italy, and I kind of put, or even my Little League baseball teams, I kind of put people into categories of people based on their face and their actions. And so I'm obviously not paying enough attention to who's actually there in front of me, unless they're really someone that I, work with or get to know. And I guess I really worked with and got to know those students as opposed to, someone who works in the same office with me.
Yeah.
But it's an odd thing.
And like context clues are really important too. So if you run into that person from, that you played soccer with, but you run into them at the grocery store, you're probably less likely to recognize them than if they were on the soccer field.
For sure.
I wonder if it's a connection. The fact that as a teacher, you're expected to connect at a deeper level. And I just wonder if that's us thinking cognitively, making that little bit of more of an effort to put the face and the name and characteristics together. Like it's interesting, the three of us are all talking about teaching, and then Peter, Kara, you said, meeting somebody in your soccer team in the grocery store. It's happened to me several times, and I didn't know who they were. But I don't think I would I would make it a problem now of somebody I taught 10 years ago, because they've gone from a 16-year-old to 26. That could be a different thing. But I wouldn't have mistaken a student in a grocery store. I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
I had it at my office, and for the past many years, I don't really go to the office, but I'll go once in a while. And I asked the office manager, do you think we could have a sort of a website with people's faces and names on it? Because I get embarrassed to ask after a couple of years. So what's your name? Even after I've learned their face. And she said, well, Peter, you could actually go talk to them and get to know them. And she had a point there. This was before any diagnosis, but she had a point. So I think probably it is that with the students, we're really focusing on them. We're interested in them. They're there. We want to help them. We like them. Whereas if it's someone who just happens to work down the hall, you're really not paying much attention.
I also try not to call people by name, just in general, in case I'm wrong. Even if I'm 99% sure that I know your name is Peter, thank God it's on your Zoom screen. You know what I mean? Like I will avoid referring to people in case I say the wrong thing.
No, me too.
That's a secret. The world's not supposed to know we do that.
And then I need my wife next to me too.
Do you have a secret code with her for when you don't remember who someone is?
No, but if I ever have to go to anything like a cocktail party, she better be standing next to me, so it's otherwise I can't manage it.
Yeah. Oh, goodness.
What would we do without our partners?
Yeah. They can be a lifeline, that's for sure.
My wife is very much remembers who the people are and names, and maybe that's her ADHD brain.
Yeah,
puts
probably
those connections together, and she just keeps it just rolling along.
Yeah.
Can I go back on a tangent back to something Peter said minute 3 of this podcast, and this is my deep question. In your book, you talked about thinking you're autistic, and you did some research. Now, exactly the same for me. Kara, you came with the research already pre-done. That's you're the anomaly in this situation. That's kind of interesting. But can we talk about what that means to discover who we are through media, literature specifically, but also now television shows, and how weird that must be to a neurotypical person? Because when you said, like, Peter, you said the book, and it's like this, you're reflecting so many people I talk to, you're reflecting my own life. And like, what are those books? And how important is that? It's almost like a written history. And we can insert ourselves into the written history through that process. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, for me, the TV show didn't work because what I found 8 or 9 years ago was so negative about autistic people. Maybe it was just my bad luck, but it was so negative that I just rejected it. I could see you don't make eye contact. You're not good at small talk. I could see the things that were in me, but I couldn't see the others. But when I finally started really, and I learn differently than some people. I'm not systematic. I dip here, I dip there, I pull up as many things as I could. When I started seeing all these traits over and over and all these stories, all of a sudden things that had driven me crazy for my entire life made perfect sense to me. Mm-hmm. So it just felt so good, to finally understand this is why I did that. This is why I acted that way. This is why I didn't understand this. And this is why I'm so good at this other thing. It was just wonderful. I mean, my life made sense for the first time. And remember, 65 years old, you've gone a long ways, and my young life had started bothering me more than at the time. At the time, I just kind of took it as this is the way of the world. I will walk alone. These other people will be with all these other people. Then I kind of was able to fake it not fake it, but I changed my life a bit in Africa and started appearing more like a normal life. But then as I raised young people, some of those old things came back and really haunted me, really hurt me. Like, why was my life that way? And so discovering the connections to being autistic and that it was just a huge relief. It was a huge relief. And the question, I'll throw out another question for later. People answer this one is, I wonder what it would have been like in a world where everybody else was autistic, like where 80% of the people were autistic, and the girls that I worried so much about in the book were autistic. Yeah. And would it have all been different? Would it have been easy and it would have all made sense to us all,
I think it would. I think it would be a lot easier. That's a great question. I think communication would be clearer. It would be interesting to pathologize the minority neurotypicals. And they obscure their meaning. They they hide everything.
Well, that's why we can't use the word disorder, because it's only a disorder in that context. And so, but I wonder, it would be wonderful to, that would be a good story to tell, actually. Mm-hmm. You place some autistic person with so much trouble in this world, in a world where they're the majority. And I do think it would be totally different than if I didn't return the call or didn't, it wouldn't have been a mystery,
Yeah.
So.
That's one of the things I like about friendships with other autistics. Like Bruce and I can be texting and not say goodbye and then resume 2 weeks later or 3 months later.
We do that a lot, don't we?
We do. We'll just be able to send a random article to read and then say nothing about it. And I've seen that in my classroom where my students, I remember having a student say, when I'm here, I don't feel autistic, which broke my heart too, because yes, it's great that you have community here, but it's terrible that you've internalized this idea that feeling autistic means being the odd one out. Mm.
I'm struggling with the idea of a neurodivergent world with neurotypicals as a minority. It's such a it's so illogical to my present condition. And it's a struggle I have when there are a lot of things in the world which are just so illogical, I cannot comprehend. And there's some political things, there's some violence against women. There's a whole bunch of things that just fundamentally I cannot grasp a single iota of logic. So therefore, I cannot comprehend. And I was kind of thinking about one of the things I enjoy about situations like this and having friends like Kara is that it's not like the rest of the day. And I wonder if some of that joy would be missing, which is a little ableist, internally ableist, isn't it? It's kind of an interesting. Have I separated myself as a disabled person so much that there is and that is so much of a core of my being that I'm incredibly comfortable with. If that disappeared, do I suddenly start feeling uncomfortable?
Oh, wow. I'm going to have to think about this longer. I don't think I can. I don't think I can comment.
It's a killer question, Peter. I mean, I think fundamentally we all went, oh yeah, that'd be fine. And then thinking about it in detail was a little, yeah. I think, and we might need to go and do some research. I'm pretty sure there was a science fiction story written by somebody like this, where a whole society was autistic or neurodivergent. I can't remember. I'll have to think about something in the back of my mind just struck a bell. But it's a kind of an interesting, it's a wonderful thought experiment.
It would change everything, because I do feel like I think autistic people understand any sort of outsider instinctively, because we've lived our lives as outsiders. Whether we knew why or not, we lived our lives on the edges, on the fringes, as an outsider. And so it would remove that. Yeah, I'm not talking about the effect on society. We'd probably be smug and obnoxious if we were the majority. but I'm just saying, on a personal level, it probably would have been way easier, because there wouldn't have been the failure to communicate that obviously happened in my youth. So
yeah. And I think
you mentioned go on, Kara, because I have a downer thing.
This is a very short point. I think in general, we'd be fairly understanding about competing sensory needs and things like that. Though, we definitely have to do some planning for ones that are really, sometimes one person needs one thing that the other person just can't stand. Like we'd have to get creative in how we designed spaces, I think. Bruce, what were you going to say?
Peter, you mentioned society, and as you talked about it, I went, no, this is kind of cool. And then I realized that I am very much somebody who thinks that fundamentally autistics can't run organizations. I don't think we've got that mind of needing to running a business, like a big business. I think that's not an autistic characteristic in general. And I always think we need partnerships. And I suddenly thought, wow, society of all autistic people, would it be all these tiny, super structured things that can't be broken, but you couldn't go into because it's not your structure?
It would be entirely anti-hierarchical, that's for sure.
And that's an interesting, I was going to say it's totally anarchical. That's not a word I can say very well. And probably anarchical in a good way, but still, yeah. Would there be a civilization as we kind of consider that? Would there be society? That's and I say it's a little downer because it's kind of like that's the reality of our situation.
I just want to live off the grid with a couple of people I know and trust in the woods somewhere. I've got some water. I have, I have lots of space, lots of forest. That's what I want.
There's an island in a lake in just north of Inuit, which is about 3 hours north of Vancouver. It's for sale right now. There's 2 cabins. As I said, it's an island in the middle of the lake, lots of forests, completely off grid. $500,000 can be yours. Well, we don't have that money, but there you go. I couldn't live off the grid.
I mean, I still want some creature comforts, but being removed and having to come into town, a couple times a month is fine for me.
It's funny you say that. You remember in the book, I wish I still had these drawings. I have a lot of my teenage stuff, but I would draw this place that I was going to live. Yeah. And I didn't want to be off the grid either because I was afraid of all the cowboy types who would drive past, so I wanted some friends around the outside edge, but I was designing my little solitary refuge.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me question this to you, Peter. Did moving to Seattle and Vancouver are kind of areas where we can pretend we're off the grid really easily? Like, do you think you moved to Seattle because that area was part of that sort of ideal that you had growing up?
No, I moved here for really specific reasons. When my brother Steve-O died, the guy who introduced me to Chuck Berry, my other brother said, "Why don't you come up here?" And so I just moved up. It was just.
But you stayed there.
I stayed there, but and also that for different reasons. So I wouldn't say that, but it was a move that, as I tried to describe in the book, it took me further away from people, that's for sure, but only because I was now in a big city living on my own. I'd been in dormitories, I'd been in pensiones, I'd been in places where I was forced to be with people. And all of a sudden I was here living alone. That was the scariest, loneliest time of my life. But no, it was a big developing city at the time. So I didn't have any sense of being off the grid or.
And why the parallel in that is you mentioned, you've created this career where you can work from home. And it's something that I see, certainly for me too, is that when I was diagnosed in my early 50s, my wife said, "You realize your entire life has been planned around being autistic." And it's like, no, I didn't. But yes,
I think in my case too, everything I've done, and I made good choices for myself, but my boss, when I had this boss who really understood me, he put me on fewer but bigger cases so that I could really do my thing. And then I left this big partnership and I only work on 1 or 2 cases at a time. Mm-hmm. And I'm never going to be rich, but I survive that way and thrive. I do quite well. But I think everything in my life has been sort of an unwitting accommodation to who I am. And it's continued. And I've been really lucky. I had that giant family, so I was never alone when I was a little kid. Mm-hmm. I had this great high school where I was really comfortable, and everybody was a little offbeat at that place. College got bad, but after that, Africa, and then refining my career so that it was more and more to my liking and fit my personality and who I am. So I daily naps.
Love it.
Ever since I went to Italy the first time, it became ingrained, and I think that really helps. So it's funny. I just think I've been lucky to have been given good choices and having made good choices all along. And I could see myself otherwise being in a very, very, very different place. It seems there are so many places where my life could have gone in a completely different direction. So
now, I know that this is always a uniquely personal choice, but sometimes people will ask me, or I'll have comments on some of the YouTube videos about people getting a late diagnosis. Is there value in getting a late diagnosis? What do you think?
For me, 110%, 120%. As I said, it took away I was angry at myself and ashamed of myself as a young man for why did you live that way? Why did you let those things happen? Mm-hmm. I had some pretty good luck if I look back on it, and yet I sort of rejected it. And so, yes, suddenly I understand my life so much better that it's a huge, huge benefit to me. And I can't see I'm at an age, I think, Kara, you and I talked about going public. Like I'm totally public. Everybody in the Washington legal community knows or soon will know because I've published various articles and things. I'm at an age and at a point in my career where there's no harm. That can't. A young engineer called me he read the book and he had said, "Peter, you've written a book about me," but he doesn't want to talk about it yet. He's asking, will I hurt myself? So for me, learning it was huge. Telling about it actually feels good. It's kind of like, so you may have found me odd, a little bit odd. This is who I am, and that actually really helps.
I love that. Can you hold up the book? Because it is our thing of the day. My So-Called Disorder by Peter O'Neill.
The cover, by the way, it includes a lot of things from the book.
I love it. The peach, yes, I
Entering
recognize
the tank. Yeah.
Autism, Exploding Trucks, and the Daddy of Rock and Roll.
Put all those together. My neighbor took the pictures, and then this is that cover. Yeah.
It's a fabulous book. I'll definitely link to it in the show notes.
That would be great.
Yeah. All right. Do we have any last questions? I'm mindful of time. I feel like we could sit here for hours and talk, but we probably shouldn't because no one else will sit through hours with us. Bruce, any
That's the problem with the world. Go on, Peter, please.
Oh, I really liked, you two did a podcast about fun, and I really liked it. It was just like, I had just told a therapist, but I'm not a fun guy. She told me to go out and do something fun. But I like the distinction between fun and enjoyment. But I knew, Bruce, I'd seen you before, so I went back and looked at and I'm sure that your podcast together about late diagnosis was the first one of these I ever watched, because I was trying to learn all about that. So It's good to finally meet you all.
Yeah, well, we're delighted that you were here to chat with us and to illuminate some of these topics. I know we did so many tangents. It was not focused, but we, as Bruce said, that's what we promise. A loosely structured interview / conversation. Now, Peter, can we talk a little bit, just sort of the last question is, in your life, how has music helped you?
Well, one thing I notice is I don't think even in old home movies there's any sign that I did any sort of classic stimming that people talk about. Yeah. But for sure, like I used to play drums when I was in high school, and I couldn't take drums to college, so I took an old guitar that someone had left at the house, and I just started, since I understood the blues already, I just started noodling on that guitar and learning licks and learning to play things. But what I notice is for the next 30 years or so, I never played music in public. I used to wonder, could I do that? And so I'm happy to learn that I can be in bands and do my part. But I think it's been something akin to stimming. It's something I do just to remain calm. I might be watching a dumb TV show, but playing licks aimlessly on the guitar. So it's huge for me.
I think it makes sense. There's a lot of people who knit and who do things like that, like repetitive motions. I'm a big fan of petting my kittens, my cats. I feel like that's a form of stimming. I'm always petting something. Bruce, what's your take on that? Musical instrumentation is stimming.
Definitely, playing can be a form of stimming, and what I was going to say is, what's interesting seeing old videos of me performing was how much I rocked. How much I rock this way, not rock and roll. And it's something that I was like completely unaware of, and certainly off stage, I wouldn't think I did. And then there's pictures. My mother, I'm sorry, sweetie, my wife said to me, like, she took a video of me conducting a choir about 5 years ago. And she said, "You dance when you conduct." I was like, "No, I don't." And there's a video of like, I'm dancing. And it's like, that's kind of weird. I think that's my vision. It's my physical stimming. And that I'm so comfortable that I'm allowing it just to happen, and not kind of consciously stopping.
Yeah, I definitely rock a lot when I sing. I have to really focus sometimes on being grounded if I'm performing.
So I don't think you do, and I think it's a common teaching thing. Like you've got to physically do this, and it's got to be like that. Don't rock. And in fact, the point about rocking is you're so much more comfortable that your body's in a much more comfortable position to project and do all those things you're supposed to be doing. Sorry for all the singing teachers out there.
Yeah, interesting too that we all have that personal connection too to music and the self-regulatory benefits of music. Yeah. Some common experiences. Well, Peter, it was so nice to connect with you and to get to know you through your book. And I really loved it. As I read, there were just so many things that you said that I thought, oh, I have the same, I interact in the world in a similar way to you. It's a fabulous resource. I think it's a good resource too for anyone who is an adult wondering about late diagnosis and wondering what autism can look like and some of the tremendous strengths, so that we're not always projecting that tragedy narrative. And it really is it's a book of someone who is living a good life and autistic, and you still have struggles as an autistic person in a world not designed for you. But I think it is a great tribute to a life well lived and still living. Bruce, any last words?
I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And I think there's so many things, there's so many parts of your experience that have opened up experience in others. And that's so super important. And it's so simple. Like this is the thing about, it's one of the part of my job being an advocate is people sort of say, I'm really proud of what you do, and this is amazing how open, and it's just like I'm just telling people who I am and what I do, and it's not that special other than this is my experience. And I found the same thing with your book. The legal aspects of it are ridiculously fascinating.
I agree,
but not in a. Is it John Grisham that writes? I don't read fiction that much, but it's like it's a great read from a legal perspective, and I think it's because your autistic is showing that these are the things, these are the connections you were making, and I think that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you both for both those comments, and it's especially reassuring. I suppose that autistic people would enjoy the book. Number one, because I wrote it really early on, or started writing when I'm trying to figure out for myself what it means. But also the legal parts. It's easy to think people will be bored to tears by the legal parts, So I'm glad when people like that.
Yeah. Okay, I do have one last question that just came to mind, so I'm going to ask it. And I don't know how much TV you watch, but are there any law shows that you actually enjoy?
Naming one would be impossible, but I actually like them all. They're all totally unrealistic. They're totally stupid. They'll have two lawyers arguing in front of the judge at the same time. That doesn't usually happen, but no, I like them all. The Good Wife was a good one, and then there was a follow to The Good Wife, The Good Fight. Yes, those I really enjoyed. Those were good.
That was my favorite as well. So I'm like, any others that are good? I miss it. Thank you.
Have you watched Attorney Woo?
That's a good one.
I watched one or two episodes, but that's all. Yeah. But obviously describing a person who to me is completely different, at least in those first few episodes. People have put me onto something called Astrid, and it's a French show. So it's good for me because I have to practice my French ear. And it's about an autistic woman who works with the police in Paris. And it's pretty good. She's it's funny because I gave a talk and I pointed out that autistic characters on TV tend to be kind of stereotypical. There's the boy on Parenthood. There's the boy on, what was that called? Another show where he likes to talk about the Antarctic, Atypical. Astrid's a little bit stereotype too. In fact, very, but it's still a good show.
I'm gonna look that up. Thank you. I'm so excited. I'm trying to learn French, so this will fuse two things that I'm very interested in: legal shows and learning French. Well,
I'm going to smile about the learning French part.
hey, I'm doing.
What a good reason for you to learn French.
Yeah, my boyfriend is French from France, so I'll be going out in December to meet his family, and I would like to be able to say more than the bare minimum. So I'm trying. I'm on day 111 on Duolingo, actually.
After this is over, I'll give you some good advice about where to learn some French.
Awesome. Oh, thank you so much. Well,
it starts with P and ends in S, and it has the word ARI in the middle of it.
Just go to Paris, immerse myself, eat lots of baguettes and pastries, and drink some wine, eat some cheese. That sounds pretty idyllic, actually. Well, thanks so much. I'm looking forward to future conversations with both of you. And I hope you all have a great day. And thank you, everyone, for hanging in there for this fascinating conversation.
Bye.
Autistic tidbits and tangents.